My son-in-law said I'd be better off dead. When I played his recording in court, he went pale. The legal documents trembled in 70-year-old Maggie's hands as 38 faces stared at her across the birthday party decorations. Her son-in-law's face drained white when she announced the trust fund, money he'd never be able to touch. 6 months ago, she'd overheard him say she was better off dead. Now, as his rage erupted in front of their 6-year-old daughter, Maggie realized the most dangerous person in her life had been living under her own roof. But how do you protect yourself from family who sees your love as weakness and your savings as their inheritance? But this story doesn't start with victory. It starts with an ordinary Tuesday morning, when a woman who'd spent 40 years reading people's intentions for her catering business was about to discover she'd been dangerously wrong about someone she trusted completely. 6 months earlier, Margaret Walsh, Maggie to everyone who mattered, stood in her pristine kitchen, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked the garden her late husband Tom had planted with such care. At 70, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent decades managing both a successful business and a busy household. Her silver hair was always neat, her clothes chosen with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to wedding cakes and anniversary celebrations. The morning routine never varied. Coffee first, then the financial section of the newspaper, followed by a careful review of her investment statements. People who didn't know her well might have found it surprising that this soft-spoken woman could discuss market volatility and dividend yields with the confidence of a seasoned broker. But those who'd watched her build Walsh Catering from nothing understood that behind her gentle demeanor lay a mind as sharp as the knives in her professional-grade kitchen. This particular Tuesday felt like any other. The autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves through her open window, and she could hear children laughing as they walked to school. In a few hours, her daughter Sarah would arrive with 6-year-old Emma for their weekly lunch, and the house would fill with the sound of little feet running through rooms that had grown too quiet since Tom's death 5 years ago. Maggie twisted her wedding ring, a habit she'd developed whenever she thought about Tom, and smiled at his photograph on the kitchen counter. 43 years of marriage had taught her to recognize the sound of different vehicles in her driveway, which is why she looked up in mild surprise when she heard David's truck pulling in 2 hours earlier than expected. David Harrison had been her son-in-law for 8 years, and she'd grown genuinely fond of his easy charm and the way he made Sarah laugh. He was handsome in that casual way that turned heads at grocery stores, with sun-streaked brown hair and the kind of smile that made people want to help him. More importantly, he seemed to adore Emma, and any man who could make her granddaughter giggle with delight had earned a permanent place in Maggie's heart. She heard his key in the front door. She'd given him 1 year ago for emergencies and called out cheerfully, "David, you're early, sweetheart. Sarah won't be here for another hour." "I know," came his voice from the living room. "I just wanted to drop something off for her." Maggie continued organizing her investment statements, humming softly to herself. She'd made good money with Walsh Catering, but more importantly, she'd been smart with every dollar. Tom had always joked that she could squeeze a penny until it screamed, but her careful management meant she'd been able to sell the business 3 years ago and retire comfortably, very comfortably, if she was honest. That's when she heard David's voice again, but this time he was clearly on the phone, and something in his tone made her pause with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "Look, I'm telling you, she's got to have at least $500,000, probably more. The old woman built that catering business from nothing, owns this house outright, and Sarah says she's got investments up the wazoo." Maggie's hand froze. Old woman. She set down her cup so quietly it barely made a sound against the saucer. David's voice continued, and each word felt like a physical blow. "She's better off dead, honestly. Then Sarah inherits everything and we can finally get out of this financial hole. Sarah's too soft to ask for what we deserve. The old lady sits on all that money while we're drowning in debt." The coffee cup slipped from Maggie's numb fingers, but she caught it just before it hit the floor. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was afraid he might hear it, but David kept talking, oblivious to the devastation he was causing in the next room. "I've been trying to get her to make Sarah the beneficiary on everything, but she's stubborn. Always wants to maintain her independence." He said the word like it tasted bitter. Maybe if something happened to her health, or if we could prove she's not competent anymore. I mean, how hard could it be? She's 70 years old. Maggie pressed her back against the kitchen wall, her legs suddenly unsteady. This couldn't be happening. This was David who brought Emma presents just because it was Tuesday, who fixed her leaky faucet without being asked, who called her Mom Walsh and made her feel like she still had a son. "What I need from you," David continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone that chilled her to the bone, "is information about how to get power of attorney, preferably without her realizing what's happening until it's too late." The room began to spin. Maggie gripped the edge of the counter, fighting the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. In 40 years of running a business, dealing with difficult customers, demanding vendors, and competitive rivals, she'd never felt this kind of betrayal. Those people had been strangers trying to take advantage of her. This was family. She heard David end the call and move around in her living room. Instinct told her to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation, to give him a chance to tell her she'd misunderstood. But 40 years of business experience whispered a different message. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them and gather evidence before you act. Moving as quietly as her shaking legs would allow, Maggie made her way to the back door. She slipped out into her garden, breathing deeply of the crisp autumn air that Tom had loved so much. The roses he'd planted were still blooming, defiant against the approaching winter, and she found herself wondering if she had that same kind of resilience left in her. Through the kitchen window, she watched David move through her house like he already owned it. He was in her home office now, and she could see him looking through papers on her desk, papers she was certain she'd left in a different order, her investment statements, her insurance policies, documents that were absolutely none of his business. 20 minutes later, David emerged from the house, called out a casual, "See you later, Mom Walsh," and drove away as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just revealed that he saw her as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be loved. Maggie stood in her garden until her hands stopped shaking, then walked back into a house that suddenly felt different. Everything looked the same. Her comfortable furniture, Tom's photographs, Emma's artwork on the refrigerator. But the safety she'd felt here for decades was gone. She was no longer a woman living independently in her own home. She was prey being stalked by a predator who happened to be married to her daughter. That night, Maggie sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and began to write. Not because she wanted to believe what she'd heard, but because she'd learned long ago that hoping for the best while preparing for the worst was how you survived in business. And this, she was beginning to realize, was going to require every business skill she'd ever developed. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Tuesday, October 15th, David's phone call." Below that, she documented every word she could remember, along with the time and circumstances. It felt clinical, detached, like she was investigating a stranger rather than someone she'd welcomed into her family. But as she wrote, something else began to emerge alongside the hurt and betrayal: anger. The kind of cold, focused anger that had once helped her stand up to suppliers who tried to cheat her, customers who refused to pay their bills, and competitors who spread lies about her business. David thought she was just a soft old woman with more money than sense. He'd forgotten that she was also a businesswoman who'd built that money by being smarter and tougher than people who'd tried to take advantage of her. Age hadn't changed that. It had just made her more experienced. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Weathered Rose Stories family. Your place in this circle of powerful, heartfelt journeys is waiting for you. These stories of women rising, healing, and reclaiming their strength have inspired thousands to find their own courage. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know the moment a new chapter of resilience and triumph is shared here with you. 3 weeks passed before David made his next move. 3 weeks during which Maggie watched and listened with the careful attention she'd once paid to the temperament of her most demanding clients. She began to see things she'd overlooked before. The way David's eyes moved around her house during family dinners, cataloging and calculating, the casual questions about her retirement planning and whether she'd updated her will lately, the suggestions that she might want to simplify her finances by letting Sarah help with the paperwork. Most unsettling of all were the small changes in her house after David's solo visits. Papers moved slightly in her desk drawer. Her jewelry box opened in a way she never left it. Her computer showing signs of use when she was certain she'd shut it down completely. He was looking for something, and she was beginning to suspect she knew what it was. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when she returned early from a doctor's appointment, a routine checkup that had gone faster than expected. She parked in her driveway and noticed David's truck was already there, which was strange since Sarah was at work and Emma was at school. Using her key as quietly as possible, Maggie let herself in through the front door and immediately heard sounds from her home office. Not the casual sounds of someone looking for a pen or notepad, but the deliberate sounds of someone conducting a thorough search. She found David sitting at her desk, going through her financial files with the systematic thoroughness of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Her investment account statements were spread across the desk surface, and he was photographing them with his phone. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then David's surprise melted into that familiar, charming smile, as if he'd been caught doing something slightly embarrassing, rather than something fundamentally violating. "Oh, hey, Mom Walsh. You scared me there." He began casually gathering the papers, but she could see him calculating, trying to determine how much she'd seen. "I was looking for a pen to leave Sarah a note, and I accidentally knocked over your papers. I was just trying to put them back in order." Maggie looked at her desk, at the systematic way her files had been arranged, at the phone in his hand, at the camera icon still visible on the screen. This wasn't an accident. This was a crime being committed in her own home by someone she'd trusted with her spare key. "David," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest, "I need to know why you're photographing my financial statements." His smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "What? No, my phone was already out and I bumped the camera button. You know how these things are." He waved the phone dismissively, but she noticed he was careful not to let her see the screen. "I heard you on the phone 3 weeks ago," she said, and watched his face go completely still. "I heard you say I was better off dead." The mask dropped so quickly it was like watching a different person step into David's body. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by something calculating and cold. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of its usual affection. "You were eavesdropping on my private conversations?" "In my own home?" "Yes." Maggie stood straighter, drawing on reserves of strength she'd thought might have faded with age. "I think you need to leave now." "I think," David said, standing slowly and making no move toward the door, "that you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Especially at your age, when people might start wondering if you're becoming confused." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and it crystallized everything for Maggie. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with honest conversation. This was a predator who'd been caught and was now showing his teeth. "Get out of my house," she said quietly, "and give me back my spare key." David's smile returned, but now it looked like a wolf baring its teeth. "I'll give it to Sarah." She might want to hang on to it in case you need help with things you can't manage anymore. After he left, Maggie sat in her violated office and tried to process what had just happened. The man who'd been part of her family for 8 years, who'd held her granddaughter as a baby, who'd mourned with them at Tom's funeral, had just threatened her in her own home. But as the shock faded, it was replaced by something David clearly hadn't expected: the strategic thinking that had made Walsh Catering successful for 4 decades. He'd made a crucial mistake by revealing his true nature too early in the game. Now she knew who she was dealing with, and she could plan accordingly. Maggie opened her laptop and began making phone calls, first to her attorney, Linda Pierce, who'd handled the business paperwork for years and knew better than anyone how sharp Maggie's mind remained. Then to her investment advisor, her insurance agent, and her bank. It was time to protect what she'd spent a lifetime building. And if David Harrison thought he was dealing with a helpless old woman, he was about to discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone who'd been fighting for what mattered most since before he was born. Chapter 2. The next morning brought Sarah to Maggie's doorstep with worry lines etched around her eyes and Emma bouncing impatiently beside her. At 34, Sarah had her father's gentle nature and her mother's intelligent eyes, though lately those eyes carried a weariness that made Maggie's heart ache. "Mom, David said you two had some kind of misunderstanding yesterday?" Sarah's voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to navigate between 2 people she loved. He seemed really upset. Maggie looked down at Emma, who was already heading toward the cookie jar with the confidence of someone who knew she was unconditionally welcomed. This conversation would need to happen carefully, very carefully. "Let's get Emma settled with a snack, and then we can talk," Maggie said, guiding them toward the kitchen where everything still felt safe and normal. As Emma munched happily on homemade oatmeal cookies, chattering about her school day and her upcoming 6th birthday party, Maggie studied her daughter's face. Sarah looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. Her clothes were perfectly clean but showing wear, and Maggie noticed she'd declined the offer of lunch, claiming she wasn't hungry. "Emma, sweetheart," Maggie said when there was a pause in the 6-year-old's enthusiastic description of her art project, "why don't you go up to the guest room and see if you can find that puzzle we started last week?" Emma bounded off with the fearless energy of childhood, leaving the 2 women alone in the kitchen that had witnessed so many important conversations over the years. "Mom," Sarah began before Maggie could speak, "I know David can be intense sometimes, but he's really worried about you living here alone. We both are." "Worried about what, specifically?" Sarah twisted her hands in her lap, a gesture Maggie remembered from Sarah's childhood whenever she was trying to avoid getting someone in trouble. "Well, you're 70 now, and this house is so big, and you don't have anyone checking on you regularly. I have Frank next door. I have you visiting twice a week, and I have a mind that's as sharp as it was when I was running a business." Maggie's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "What exactly has David told you about my capabilities?" "It's not like that." Sarah's response came too quickly, too defensively. "It's just, he mentioned that you seemed confused when he visited yesterday, that you accused him of things that didn't make sense." There it was. David was already laying the groundwork, planting seeds of doubt about her mental state. It was clever, actually. Use her age against her, make her sound paranoid and unstable, discredit her before she could expose him. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Maggie reached across the table and took her daughter's hands. "Are you and David having financial problems?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a grease fire, impossible to ignore and potentially dangerous. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, guilt, and finally, reluctant admission. "Everyone has financial stress, Mom. That's just part of being married with a child. That's not what I asked." Sarah pulled her hands away and stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the garden where she'd played as a child. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet Maggie had to strain to hear it. David made some investments that didn't work out, and he's been having trouble finding consistent work since the construction industry slowed down, but it's temporary. He's working on some new opportunities. How temporary? And how much trouble? Mom, I can't... Sarah's voice cracked slightly. We're managing. We don't need you to worry about us. But Maggie was already worrying, and not just about their financial situation. She was worrying about a pattern of behavior that was becoming clearer with each conversation. David wasn't just interested in her money, he was desperate for it. And desperate people made dangerous choices. Sarah, yesterday I found David going through my financial papers in my office. He was photographing my investment statements with his phone. Sarah spun around, her face flushed with what looked like embarrassment rather than surprise. There has to be an explanation. There is. He told me he was looking for a pen and accidentally knocked the papers over. But they weren't scattered, Sarah. They were arranged in neat piles sorted by type, like someone had been studying them systematically. Maybe he was trying to help. Help with what? I don't need help managing my finances. I built a successful business from nothing. I've been handling my own investments for decades, and my mind is perfectly clear. Maggie's voice was getting firmer, but she could see Sarah pulling back with each word. The question is, what kind of help did David think I needed, and why didn't either of you ask me directly? Sarah's silence stretched long enough for them to hear Emma's footsteps overhead, moving furniture around as she searched for the puzzle. Finally, Sarah spoke without looking at her mother. He just thinks that maybe it would be easier if you had someone helping with the paperwork, someone you trust. Someone like him, someone like me. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. He thinks I should have power of attorney just in case something happens to you, just for convenience. There it was, the real plan. Not crude theft or manipulation, but a legal transfer of power that would give David access to everything through Sarah. And Sarah, stressed by financial problems and genuinely worried about her mother's well-being, would be the perfect unwitting accomplice. Sarah, look at me. Maggie waited until her daughter turned around, noting the unshed tears in her eyes. Do I seem incapable of managing my own affairs? No, but do I seem confused or forgetful? No. Mom, but you're 70 and things can change quickly at your age. Things like what? My ability to balance a checkbook? My capacity to read investment reports? My judgment about people's character? Maggie stood up, moving closer to her daughter. Or is it possible that someone has been suggesting I'm declining because it serves their purposes? Sarah's face crumpled, and suddenly she looked like the little girl who used to run to her mother whenever the world seemed too complicated to navigate alone. I don't know what to think anymore, she whispered. David says one thing, you're saying another, and I'm caught in the middle trying to figure out what's true and what's just misunderstanding. Maggie felt her heart break a little for her daughter, caught between loyalty to her husband and growing awareness that something wasn't right. But she also felt a familiar resolve settling in her chest, the same determination that had helped her build a business when everyone said a woman couldn't succeed in the catering industry. Sarah, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be difficult. I want you to pay attention, not to what anyone tells you about my behavior, but to what you actually observe. I want you to notice whether I seem confused when we talk, whether I'm forgetting things, whether I'm making poor decisions. Mom, and I want you to ask yourself why David is so interested in my finances when he's never shown that interest before. Why the urgency? Why now? Before Sarah could answer, Emma came clattering down the stairs with the puzzle box clutched in her small hands. Grandma, I found it, and I found something else too. She held up a small digital recorder, the kind Maggie had used for business notes years ago and forgotten about. This was on the shelf. What's it for? Sarah and Maggie looked at each other across the kitchen, both thinking the same thing. How many conversations might have been recorded accidentally? And more importantly, had any of them been the kind of conversations David wouldn't want anyone else to hear? "It's just an old business tool, sweetheart," Maggie said calmly, taking the recorder. But as she held it, she realized she'd just been handed something potentially valuable. "Emma, why don't you start the puzzle on the dining room table? Your mom and I need to finish our grown-up talk." As Emma skipped away, chattering to herself about puzzle strategies, Sarah watched her mother with new attention. Maybe for the first time in months, she was really looking, seeing the sharp intelligence in Maggie's eyes, the steady competence in her movements, the strategic thinking that had always been her mother's greatest strength. "Mom," Sarah said slowly, "what aren't you telling me about David?" And for the first time since that terrible phone call 3 weeks ago, Maggie felt a flicker of hope, because Sarah was asking the right question, and that meant she might be ready to hear the answer. "I'm not telling you," Maggie said carefully, "that your husband sees me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. I'm not telling you that his interest in my finances has nothing to do with my welfare and everything to do with his own needs. And I'm not telling you that I think you're in danger of being used as a weapon against someone who loves you more than her own life." Sarah stared at her mother, processing words that probably confirmed fears she'd been trying not to acknowledge. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but sad. "What do you need me to do?" It was the question Maggie had been hoping to hear, and it told her everything she needed to know about her daughter's character. Sarah might have been fooled, manipulated, and caught off guard, but when faced with the truth, she chose loyalty to what was right over loyalty to what was comfortable. "I need you to be careful," Maggie said. "I need you to pay attention to what David does, not just what he says. And I need you to trust that if I'm taking precautions, it's because I have good reasons, not because I'm becoming paranoid with age." "What kind of precautions?" "The kind that protect all of us, including Emma." Maggie glanced toward the dining room where her granddaughter was humming while sorting puzzle pieces. "Because this isn't just about money, Sarah. It's about making sure Emma grows up in a family where love doesn't come with conditions and where being vulnerable doesn't make you a target. I'd love to hear about the people in your life who've surprised you, both the ones who turned out to be treasures and those who showed their true colors when you least expected it. Share your experience in the comments below." That evening, after Sarah and Emma had gone home with promises to talk more soon, Maggie sat in her home office with a clarity of purpose she hadn't felt since the early days of building her business. She'd spent 3 weeks gathering information and confirming suspicions. Now it was time to build defenses. Her first call was to Linda Pierce, her attorney for the past 15 years. Linda had handled everything from business contracts to Tom's estate, and she knew better than anyone that Maggie's mind remained as sharp as ever. "Maggie, it's good to hear from you." Linda's voice was warm but professional. "What can I do for you?" "I need to restructure some of my assets, and I need it done quickly but carefully. I have reason to believe someone might try to challenge my competency in order to gain access to my estate." There was a pause, and when Linda spoke again, her tone had shifted to the focused attention Maggie remembered from their most complex business negotiations. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" And Maggie? "Bring documentation of everything you've observed or experienced that's prompted this concern. If we're going to protect you, we need to build an unshakable foundation." The next morning found Maggie in Linda's downtown office, a space that smelled of leather and legal books and the kind of serious conversation that changed lives. Linda, a woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades fighting for her clients, listened with growing concern as Maggie laid out the evidence, the recordings from the digital device, which had indeed captured several of David's casual inquiries about her health and finances. The photographs she'd taken of her office after David's searches, showing the systematic way her papers had been disturbed. The timeline of his escalating interest in her assets, coinciding with what Sarah had revealed about their financial problems. "This is elder abuse," Linda said bluntly when Maggie finished. "Financial elder abuse with elements of psychological manipulation. And if he's researching incompetency procedures while simultaneously documenting alleged signs of confusion, it's also fraud. Can you prove that? We can build a case, but more importantly, we can build protections that make his plans impossible to execute." Linda pulled out a legal pad and began sketching diagrams. "First, we establish your competency beyond question. Cognitive evaluation, medical assessment, multiple professional attestations of your mental acuity. And then we create legal structures that protect your assets, regardless of what happens to you. Irrevocable trusts, medical directives, financial power of attorney to someone who isn't family, succession planning that can't be challenged." Linda looked up from her notes. "Essentially, we make you bulletproof." Over the following weeks, Maggie threw herself into the project with the same systematic thoroughness she'd once applied to expanding her catering business into 3 counties. Medical evaluations confirmed her excellent health and mental acuity. Cognitive assessments documented her sharp memory and decision-making abilities. Professional references from her former business associates testified to her continued strategic thinking and sound judgment. Meanwhile, she watched and documented David's behavior with the patient attention of a scientist studying a dangerous specimen. His visits became more frequent and more focused on her daily routines. His questions about her confusion and forgetfulness became more leading and specific. His suggestions about simplifying her life grew more insistent. Most troubling of all, he began using Emma as an unwitting source of information. "Grandma," Emma said one afternoon as they worked together in the garden, "Daddy asked me if you ever forget where you put things or if you ever ask the same question twice." Maggie's hand stilled on the rose bush she was pruning. "What did you tell him?" "I said you remember everything, like where we put the special cookies and what stories I like best and when my birthday is." Emma looked up with the serious expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something. "But then, Daddy said maybe I just don't notice because I'm little." "What do you think about that?" "I think Daddy doesn't know you as well as I do," Emma said with the devastating honesty of childhood. "You're not like great-grandpa was before he got sick. You're not confused at all." That evening, Maggie added Emma's innocent testimony to her growing file of evidence. David was coaching a 6-year-old to observe and report on her grandmother's alleged cognitive decline. It was psychological manipulation of the cruelest kind, using a child's love as a weapon. The breaking point came 6 weeks after Sarah's kitchen table revelation. Maggie returned from a routine dental cleaning to find David in her house again, this time with a man she didn't recognize. They were in her living room and David was speaking in the hushed, concerned tones of a worried family member. "As you can see, Doctor Peterson, she's living alone in this big house, and we're all concerned about her ability to manage her affairs safely. Just last week, my wife found her mother looking for her car keys for 20 minutes. They were in her purse the whole time." Maggie stood in her own doorway, invisible to the 2 men, and listened to David lie with such casual confidence that it took her breath away. The incident he was describing had never happened, but he was presenting it to someone who was clearly evaluating her living situation and mental capacity. Dr. Peterson, a thin man with a clipboard and the demeanor of someone accustomed to making life-changing decisions about elderly people, nodded sympathetically. Memory issues are often the first sign that independent living is becoming unsafe. Has she had any accidents, falls, kitchen fires, medication errors? "Nothing major yet," David said, "but we're all worried it's just a matter of time. The family is starting to think she might need some help making important decisions." Well, based on what you've told me, I'd be happy to do a preliminary assessment. Sometimes a professional evaluation can help families make difficult decisions about care and financial management. Maggie backed away from the doorway, her heart pounding with fury and something approaching fear. David had brought a professional evaluator to her home without her knowledge, feeding him fabricated stories about her competency. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was a coordinated attack on her independence and dignity. But as the initial shock faded, it was replaced by cold, strategic anger. David had just made a crucial mistake. He'd revealed the scope of his plan and involved a third party who could serve as a witness to his deception. More importantly, he'd underestimated her ability to fight back. That afternoon, Maggie made 3 phone calls. The first was to Linda Pierce, reporting the unauthorized evaluation and providing the evaluator's name for investigation. The second was to her own physician, requesting an immediate and comprehensive cognitive assessment to counter any false reports David might generate. The third call was to Detective Carmen Rodriguez, whom Linda had recommended as someone with extensive experience in elder abuse cases. Mrs. Walsh, Detective Rodriguez's voice was calm and professional. "Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I think it's time we discuss filing formal charges." As Maggie hung up the phone, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Tom's death, the sensation of having powerful allies in a fight that mattered. David thought he was hunting a helpless old woman. Instead, he'd awakened a businesswoman who'd spent 4 decades outmaneuvering people who tried to take what she'd earned. The war was about to begin in earnest, and Maggie Walsh had no intention of losing. Chapter 3. Detective Carmen Rodriguez was nothing like Maggie had expected. Instead of the gruff, cynical investigator she'd imagined, she found herself sitting across from a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who'd heard every possible family horror story and still believed in justice. "Mrs. Walsh, I've reviewed the materials your attorney provided, and I want you to know that what you're experiencing is more common than most people realize." Detective Rodriguez opened a thick folder and spread out photographs and documents. Financial exploitation of elderly family members has increased by 40% in the past 5 years. The average loss is over $100,000. "I haven't lost any money yet," Maggie said. "No, but that's because you recognized the threat early and took action. Most victims don't realize what's happening until significant damage has been done." The detective pulled out a legal pad. "What I need to establish is a clear pattern of behavior that demonstrates intent to defraud. From what I've seen so far, your son-in-law has been remarkably systematic." Over the next hour, Maggie laid out the complete timeline: the overheard phone call, the systematic searches of her home, the coached questions to Emma, the false stories to Dr. Peterson, the pressure on Sarah to seek power of attorney. With each detail, Detective Rodriguez's expression grew more serious. "Has he ever physically threatened you?" "Not directly, but he's made comments about accidents that could happen to elderly people living alone, and he's suggested that people my age can't be trusted to make important decisions." That's psychological intimidation. Combined with the financial planning and the attempt to bring in a professional evaluator under false pretenses, we have grounds for charges of attempted elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Detective Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression serious but encouraging. "Mrs. Walsh, I need to ask you something difficult. Are you prepared for this to become public? Are you prepared for your family to be torn apart by legal proceedings?" Maggie thought about Emma's innocent face, Sarah's growing awareness, and David's calculating smile. "Detective, my family is already being torn apart. The only question is whether it's destroyed by his greed or saved by the truth. Then let's save it." 3 days later, Maggie sat in her garden with Frank Kowalski, her neighbor and unexpected ally in this fight she'd never wanted. Frank, at 73, moved with the deliberate care of someone whose knees had seen better days, but his mind was as sharp as the day he'd retired from the Postal Service 15 years ago. "You know, Maggie," Frank said, settling into the lawn chair she'd bought specifically for his visits. "I never liked that boy from the beginning. Too smooth, too interested in things that weren't his business. Why didn't you ever say anything?" "What was I going to say?" "Your daughter married a man who gives me the creeps. You would have thought I was a cranky old man who didn't want Sarah to be happy." Frank accepted the iced tea she offered him with a grateful nod. "But I've been keeping an eye on things, especially after you told me what was happening." "Keeping an eye on things how?" Frank's weathered face creased into a smile that reminded Maggie why she'd always liked him. 30 years delivering mail teaches you to notice patterns, like how David's been showing up here when he knows you're supposed to be out, or how he's been walking around your house taking pictures with his phone, real casual-like, but still taking pictures. "You saw him taking pictures?" "Last Tuesday, while you were at your doctor's appointment. He walked all around the outside of the house, taking shots of the windows, the doors, the security system setup. Then he tried the back gate, the one that leads to your garden." Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Did he get in?" "Nope, but only because I happened to be working in my yard and asked him real loud if he needed help with something. He jumped about a foot and gave me some story about checking Sarah's old tree swing for safety." "There is no tree swing." "I know. Been looking at your backyard for 20 years. Frank sipped his tea thoughtfully. "Point is, he's been casing the place like someone planning a break-in, or planning to make it look like you had an accident." The implications hit Maggie like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on protecting her money that she hadn't fully considered he might be planning something more direct, more permanent. "Frank, I need to ask you a favor." "Anything." "I need you to be my witness. Not just to what you've seen, but to what you're seeing. I have security cameras now, but they can be disabled. I have legal protections, but they don't help if something happens to me." Frank's expression grew grim. "You think he'd actually hurt you?" "I think a man desperate enough to use a 6-year-old as a spy is desperate enough to do anything." Maggie looked across her garden at the roses Tom had planted, still blooming despite the approaching winter. "I think I've been naive about just how dangerous this situation has become." That evening brought Sarah to her doorstep, but this time she came alone. Emma was at a sleepover, and Sarah's face carried the weight of someone who'd been wrestling with difficult truths. "Mom, I need to tell you some things," Sarah said without preamble as they settled in the living room. "And I need you to know that I'm not making excuses for David anymore." "I'm listening." "The financial problems are worse than I told you." "Much worse." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. "David hasn't just made bad investments. He's been gambling. Online poker, sports betting, some kind of cryptocurrency thing that I don't understand. We're behind on everything. The mortgage, the car payments, Emma's school fees." "How long has this been going on?" 2 years that I know of. Probably longer." Sarah looked up at her mother with tears in her eyes. "And I think he's been using Emma to get information about your routines, your habits, your financial situation, things a 6-year-old wouldn't think were important to keep private." Maggie reached for her daughter's hand. "What changed? What made you realize this?" Emma came home from school yesterday talking about how her friend's daddy helps her mommy with big girl money decisions. She asked me why Daddy doesn't help you with your money like that. Sarah wiped her eyes with her free hand. When I asked her what she meant, she said Daddy told her that grandmas sometimes need help from their families because their brains get old and forget important things. And she said she told Daddy that your brain works fine because you remember all her favorite cookies and stories and games. But Daddy said maybe she's too little to notice when grown-ups are confused. The manipulation was even worse than Maggie had realized. David wasn't just using Emma as a source of information, he was systematically undermining her relationship with her grandmother, planting seeds of doubt about Maggie's competence in the mind of a child who loved her unconditionally. "Sarah, there's something else you need to know." Maggie made a decision that would change everything between them. "I've been working with the police. David's behavior constitutes elder abuse, and they're building a case against him." Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, guilt, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. "Are you going to have him arrested?" "I'm going to protect myself, my assets, and my granddaughter from someone who sees all of us as obstacles to his financial goals." Maggie squeezed Sarah's hand. "The question is, are you going to help me, or are you going to try to protect him?" "I can't protect him anymore, Mom. I don't even know who he really is." Sarah's voice broke slightly. "But I'm scared. If he goes to jail, Emma and I lose our home. If he doesn't, we're all in danger from someone I thought I knew. Then we make sure you and Emma are safe before anything else happens." "How?" "You both come stay here. Tonight. We tell David you need some space to think about your marriage, and you need to keep Emma away from the situation until things are resolved." Sarah nodded slowly, and Maggie could see her daughter making the same kind of difficult but necessary decision that had once built a successful business from nothing. Sometimes survival meant choosing the harder path that led to genuine safety over the easier path that led to continued danger. "Mom, there's one more thing." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Yesterday, I found papers in David's desk. Legal documents about guardianship procedures and something called emergency conservatorship. And there was a list of nursing homes with prices and availability. The final piece fell into place. David's plan wasn't just to gain control of her assets. It was to have her declared incompetent and institutionalized, clearing the way for complete access to everything she'd built while removing her ability to fight back. Did you take pictures of those documents?" "I was afraid to, but I memorized the names of the nursing homes and the law firm he's been consulting with." "Good. Detective Rodriguez will need that information." Maggie stood up, feeling the familiar surge of strategic energy that had once helped her navigate the most complex business challenges. "Sarah, go get Emma and bring her here tonight. Tomorrow, we're going to end this." "How?" "By giving David exactly what he thinks he wants, and then showing him why it was the last thing he should have asked for." "Has someone you trusted ever revealed their true nature in a moment of crisis? These turning points can be devastating, but they also show us our own strength. Share how you found your courage when someone's mask finally fell away. The next morning brought the kind of autumn clarity that made everything seem possible. Maggie woke before dawn, as she had every day for the past 40 years. But this time, she felt the same focused anticipation she'd once experienced before major catering events. The mixture of nervousness and excitement that came with knowing that careful preparation was about to be tested in real time. Sarah and Emma were still sleeping in the guest room, exhausted by the emotional upheaval of the previous evening. But their presence in the house filled it with a warmth Maggie hadn't felt since Tom's death. This was what family was supposed to feel like: protective, supportive, honest, and safe. At 8 o'clock sharp, Linda Pierce called with news that changed everything. "Maggie, we have a problem and an opportunity." Linda's voice was tense but determined. "Detective Rodriguez just informed me that David filed a petition yesterday for emergency guardianship, claiming you're suffering from dementia and pose a danger to yourself and others." "Based on what evidence?" "Fabricated evidence, Doctor. Peterson, the man David brought to your house, filed a report claiming you were confused during his assessment, that your home was in disarray, and that you displayed classic signs of cognitive decline." Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. "That assessment never happened. He never even spoke to me. I know, which is why this is also an opportunity. David has just committed perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. Dr. Peterson has filed a false professional report. They've both created a paper trail that proves criminal intent. What happens now? Now we fight back. The guardianship hearing is scheduled for Friday morning. We have 3 days to present evidence that not only proves your competence, but demonstrates that this entire proceeding is an attempt to defraud you. What do you need from me? Everything. Medical records, cognitive assessments, financial records, showing your competent management of complex assets, testimony from people who've observed your mental acuity, and most importantly, evidence of David's real motives. By noon, Maggie's house had been transformed into a war room. Linda Pierce sat at the dining room table with files spread across its surface. Detective Rodriguez occupied the living room with recording equipment and evidence bags. Frank Kowalski served as lookout from the front porch, watching for David's truck with the vigilance of a man who'd spent 30 years paying attention to details others missed. Sarah had taken Emma to the park, both to keep the child away from the adult crisis unfolding and to give herself time to process the magnitude of David's deception. When she returned, her face carried the determined expression Maggie remembered from Sarah's teenage years when she'd decided to stand up to a school bully. "Mom, I called David," Sarah said without preamble. "I told him Emma and I are staying here for a while, and I told him about the guardianship petition." How did he react? At first he tried to sound concerned and reasonable. He said he was only trying to protect you, that he was worried about your safety, that he thought professional evaluation would give everyone peace of mind. And then I told him I knew about the gambling debts, the nursing home research, and the fake assessment report. That's when his mask came off completely. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly. "He said that you've been poisoning me against him, that you're a manipulative old woman who's destroying our marriage out of spite, and that if I didn't support the guardianship petition, I'd be responsible for whatever happens to you." Whatever happens to me? His exact words were, "Old people living alone have accidents all the time. Falls downstairs, gas leaks, break-ins gone wrong. It would be tragic if something happened to her, because her own daughter was too stubborn to accept help." The room fell silent except for the sound of Detective Rodriguez's pen moving across her notepad. Finally, the detective looked up. "That's a threat. Direct, specific, and witnessed." She turned to Sarah. "Are you willing to testify to that conversation?" "Yes." "Good, because we're going to need every piece of evidence we can gather." Detective Rodriguez stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet neighborhood street. "Mrs. Walsh, I need to be honest with you. David Harrison is escalating rapidly, and that makes him dangerous. The guardianship petition tells us he's running out of time and patience. When people like him feel cornered, they sometimes do desperate things." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that until Friday's hearing, you're not safe alone in this house. And I'm saying that we need to be prepared for David to try something that goes beyond legal manipulation." As if summoned by their conversation, Frank's voice called from the front porch. "He's here." David's truck just pulled into the driveway. Through the window, they watched David climb out of his truck and walk toward the house, with the confident stride of someone who believed he held all the cards. He was dressed in his most professional clothes, khakis and a button-down shirt that made him look responsible and concerned rather than desperate and dangerous. His knock on the door was polite, reasonable, the knock of a loving son-in-law who just wanted to check on his wife and child. "Sarah?" His voice called through the door. "Honey, I know you're upset, but we need to talk." This whole situation has gotten out of hand. Detective Rodriguez motioned for everyone to stay quiet while she positioned herself where she could observe but not be seen. Maggie approached the door but didn't open it. "David, Sarah, and Emma are fine, and they're going to stay here for a while." Maggie, I know you think I'm the enemy, but I'm really trying to help. The guardianship petition is for your own protection. I've seen how confused you get sometimes, and I'm worried about your safety. I'm not confused, David. I know exactly what you're doing and why. There was a long pause, and when David spoke again, his voice had lost its reasonable tone and taken on an edge that made everyone in the room tense. Let me talk to my wife, Maggie. Let me talk to my daughter. They don't want to talk to you right now. They're my family. You can't keep them from me. They're staying here voluntarily, David. They're not being kept anywhere. Another pause, longer this time. When David's voice came again, the mask had dropped completely. You know what, Maggie? You're making a big mistake. Bigger than you realize, but don't worry. After Friday, you won't be making any more mistakes. Someone else will be making all your decisions for you. Is that a threat? It's a promise. See you in court. They watched through the window as David returned to his truck, but instead of leaving immediately, he sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, talking on his phone. His body language was agitated, angry, and when he finally drove away, he accelerated hard enough to leave rubber marks on the street. Well, Detective Rodriguez said grimly, I think we can safely say that David Harrison has just declared war. The question is, are we ready to fight back? Maggie looked around her living room at the people who'd rallied to her defense. Her attorney, a police detective, her loyal neighbor, and her daughter who'd finally chosen truth over comfort. Then she thought about Emma napping upstairs in the room where her own daughter had once felt safe and loved. Detective, I've been fighting for what matters most since before that man was born. The only difference is that now I have help. Then let's make sure we win. Chapter 4. The 3 days between David's threat and the guardianship hearing passed in a blur of preparation that reminded Maggie of the intense planning required for her biggest catering events, except the stakes had never been this high. Her home had become a headquarters where lawyers, police officers, medical professionals, and character witnesses worked around the clock to build a case that would not only defeat David's petition, but expose his criminal behavior. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, a geriatric psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, conducted a comprehensive cognitive evaluation that took 4 hours and covered everything from memory tests to complex problem-solving scenarios. Her preliminary conclusion was delivered with the authority of someone whose professional reputation was built on accuracy. Mrs. Walsh demonstrates cognitive function, consistent with someone 20 years younger, excellent judgment, superior memory, and no signs whatsoever of dementia or cognitive decline. Meanwhile, Detective Rodriguez had been building the criminal case with methodical precision. Bank records showed David's gambling losses exceeded $60,000 over 2 years. Credit reports revealed debts that would take decades to repay on his sporadic income. Phone records confirmed calls to nursing homes, elder law attorneys, and Dr. Peterson on dates that directly corresponded to his escalating pressure on Maggie. Most damning of all, a search warrant executed on David's home had uncovered a file folder labeled Mom Walsh Estate Plan, containing detailed financial information about Maggie's assets, photocopied bank statements, insurance policies, and a handwritten timeline tracking her supposed cognitive decline, with fabricated incidents that had never occurred. The man kept evidence of his own fraud. Linda Pierce marveled as she reviewed the police report. Either he's incredibly arrogant or incredibly stupid. Probably both, Detective Rodriguez replied. Criminals like him usually believe they're smarter than everyone else right up until the handcuffs go on. Thursday night, the evening before the hearing, found Maggie sitting in her garden as the sun set behind the roses Tom had planted with such care. Sarah and Emma had gone inside to watch a movie, their voices carrying through the open windows like a promise that normal family life might still be possible. Frank appeared at the gate between their yards, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints protested the autumn chill. "Big day tomorrow," he said, settling into the chair that had become his usual spot for their evening conversations. "The biggest in a long time. You scared?" Maggie considered the question seriously. "I'm scared of what this is doing to Emma. I'm scared of what it's revealed about the man my daughter married. I'm scared of how close we came to losing everything because I trusted the wrong person. But I'm not scared of tomorrow." Tomorrow, we end this. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that seemed designed for important decisions. Maggie dressed with the same care she'd once applied to major business meetings, a navy blue suit that conveyed both respectability and strength, pearl earrings that had been Tom's gift on their 20th anniversary, and the watch she'd bought herself the day she signed the lease on her first commercial kitchen. The courthouse was exactly what she'd expected, imposing marble columns and high ceilings designed to remind everyone that serious justice happened within these walls. But the courtroom itself was smaller than she'd imagined, more intimate, which somehow made the proceedings feel more personal rather than less. David sat at one table with his attorney, a thin man whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the fact that he looked uncomfortable with his client's case. David himself appeared confident, even triumphant, nodding respectfully at the judge and occasionally glancing at Maggie with what looked like pity but felt like contempt. At the other table, Maggie sat flanked by Linda Pierce and Detective Rodriguez, with Sarah beside her as moral support and witness. The array of evidence folders, medical reports, and character reference letters spread before them told the story of a woman who'd built a life of accomplishment and was fighting to keep it from being stolen by someone who'd never earned anything honestly. Judge Helen Morrison was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from fiction in family disputes. She reviewed the initial petition with the careful attention of someone who understood that guardianship decisions could destroy lives if made carelessly. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Morrison began, "your petition claims that Mrs. Walsh is suffering from dementia and is unable to manage her personal or financial affairs safely. What evidence do you present to support this claim?" David's attorney stood and presented Dr. Peterson's report with the confidence of someone who believed he held the winning card. "Your Honor, Doctor." Peterson's professional assessment clearly documents Mrs. Walsh's confusion, memory lapses, and inability to maintain her living environment safely. We also have testimony from family members about concerning incidents that demonstrate her declining capacity. "Mrs. Pierce," the judge turned to Linda, "how do you respond to these allegations?" Linda stood with the calm authority of someone who'd spent 3 days building an unshakable case. "Your Honor, every single allegation in this petition is not only false, but demonstrably fabricated. We have evidence that Dr. Peterson never actually evaluated Mrs. Walsh, that the incidents described never occurred, and that this entire proceeding is an attempt to defraud an elderly woman of her assets and independence." "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Pierce. Can you substantiate it?" "We can, Your Honor, and we can prove that Mr. Harrison has committed multiple felonies in pursuit of this fraudulent guardianship." For the next 2 hours, the courtroom became a theater where truth and lies battled for supremacy. David's attorney presented Dr. Peterson's fabricated report, only to have Linda systematically destroy it with security camera footage showing that doctor. Peterson had never actually spoken to Maggie during his visit to her home. David testified about Maggie's concerning behavior, describing incidents of confusion and forgetfulness that he claimed to have witnessed. But Detective Rodriguez then presented evidence that on the dates of these alleged incidents, either David hadn't been at Maggie's house at all, or the security cameras showed no such behavior occurring. Most devastating of all was the presentation of the evidence found in David's home search, the detailed financial information he'd gathered without authorization, the fabricated timeline of cognitive decline, and the research into nursing homes and legal procedures for taking control of elderly people's assets. When it came time for character witnesses, the courtroom filled with people who'd known Maggie for decades. Her former business manager testified to her continued sharp handling of complex financial decisions. Her physician confirmed her excellent cognitive health. Frank spoke with quiet dignity about her daily competence and the way she'd recognized and responded appropriately to David's threats. But it was Sarah's testimony that proved most powerful. Standing at the witness stand, she looked directly at her husband as she spoke. "Your Honor, I've been married to David Harrison for 8 years, and I've been Margaret Walsh's daughter for 34 years. David told me my mother was becoming confused and needed help with her finances. But the truth is, my mother's mind is as sharp as it ever was. The person who was confused was me, confused about the man I married and what he was really planning to do to someone I love." David's face went through a series of expressions as he watched his wife destroy his case and possibly his freedom. The confident mask he'd worn all morning finally slipped, revealing something desperate and ugly underneath. "She's lying," he said, loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. "They've all turned against me. The old woman poisoned them against me because she's selfish and doesn't want to help her own family." "Mr. Harrison," Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like ice, "you'll have an opportunity to present your case. Right now, you'll remain silent or be removed from these proceedings." But David was beyond caring about courtroom decorum. "She has millions of dollars sitting in banks while my family struggles to pay bills. She owes us that money. Sarah is her only child and Emma is her only grandchild. We deserve—" "Mr. Harrison," the judge's voice rose sharply. "You're out of order!" "Bailiff, please escort Mr. Harrison from the courtroom." As David was led away, still shouting about what he deserved and how unfair it all was, Judge Morrison turned to the evidence before her with an expression that suggested she'd heard enough. "Based on the evidence presented, this petition for guardianship is not only denied, but appears to be part of a coordinated attempt to defraud Mrs. Walsh. I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for immediate criminal investigation." She looked directly at Maggie, her expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Walsh, you've demonstrated remarkable presence of mind in protecting yourself from what can only be described as a predatory attack on your independence and assets. This court finds you to be completely competent to manage your own affairs and commends you for your courage in exposing this fraud." Outside the courthouse, as autumn sunlight streamed through gold-leaf trees, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months: complete safety. David would face criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. Dr. Peterson would lose his license and face prosecution for filing false professional reports. Most importantly, the legal precedent was now established that any future attempts to challenge her competency would be viewed with extreme skepticism. "Mom," Sarah said as they walked toward the parking garage, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make." "You don't owe me anything, sweetheart. You were being manipulated by someone who was very good at making his greed look like concern. But I should have seen it. I should have trusted my instincts about you instead of trusting his lies about you." Maggie stopped walking and turned to face her daughter in the middle of the busy sidewalk. "Sarah, you did see it. When it mattered most, when Emma's safety was at stake, you chose truth over comfort. You chose love over fear. That's all any of us can do." 3 weeks later, Emma's 7th birthday party was everything a child's celebration should be. Filled with laughter, presents, cake, and the kind of joy that made adults remember why protecting innocence was worth any fight. But this party was also something more. As friends, family, and Neighbors gathered in Maggie's living room. It became a celebration of survival, truth, and the kind of family bonds that grow stronger under pressure rather than breaking. The most important moment came when Maggie stood in the center of her decorated living room, holding legal documents that represented far more than financial planning. They represented security, foresight, and love, expressed through action rather than words. "Before we sing happy birthday," she announced to the gathered crowd, "I have a special gift for Emma." Emma looked up from her pile of presents with the bright-eyed attention of a child who'd learned that her grandmother always delivered on her promises. "I've established an educational trust fund that will ensure Emma's college education and future opportunities, regardless of any financial difficulties her family might face." Maggie's voice was clear and strong, carrying easily through the room. "This trust has very specific protections. No parent, step-parent, or guardian can access these funds for any purpose except Emma's education and approved activities." The room erupted in applause, but Maggie wasn't finished. "I created this trust because I learned something important over the past few months. I learned that sometimes the people who claim to love our children might put their own financial needs ahead of what's best for the child. Emma will never have to worry about someone using her inheritance as leverage or viewing her as a financial opportunity." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her mother turn a moment of celebration into a lesson about protection, foresight, and the difference between conditional and unconditional love. Frank stood up from his chair near the window, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that comes from witnessing justice done correctly. "Maggie," he said in his gruff but gentle voice, "some of us owe you an apology. We let a smooth talker convince us that your wisdom was confusion and your strength was stubbornness. You showed us what it really means to protect family." The celebration continued with cake, games, and the kind of storytelling that creates lasting memories. But as the afternoon wound down and guests began to leave, Maggie found herself standing in her kitchen with Sarah and Emma, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of a successful party. "Grandma," Emma said as she helped stack paper plates in the trash, "I'm glad Daddy David can't be mean to you anymore. Mommy is happier now, too." The child's innocent wisdom cut straight to the heart of what had really been at stake. This hadn't just been about money or legal documents or even personal safety. It had been about preserving the kind of family environment where children could trust that the adults in their lives put love ahead of greed. "Emma," Maggie said, kneeling down to her granddaughter's eye level, "do you know what I learned from this whole experience?" "What?" "I learned that protecting the people you love sometimes means having difficult conversations and making hard choices, but it's always worth it. Because family takes care of each other. Because real family takes care of each other. Not because of what they can get, but because of who they are." As the sun set behind the garden Tom had planted with such care, 3 generations of women sat at the kitchen table that had witnessed so many important conversations. They were safe, they were together, and they were stronger for having survived a test that could have destroyed them. "Mom," Sarah said as Emma colored at the table between them, "I've been thinking about something. About the trust fund and the way you planned all of this. What about it? You didn't just protect Emma's future, you protected her innocence. She'll never have to wonder if someone loves her for who she is or for what she might inherit. That was the point. And you protected me too, from making a choice between my husband and my mother based on lies." Maggie reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Sarah, I've been protecting you since the day you were born. That doesn't stop just because you're grown up and have a child of your own." Later that evening, after Sarah and Emma had gone home to the small apartment they'd rented nearby, Maggie sat in her living room with a letter she'd been writing to Tom. It was a habit she'd developed since his death, a way of processing important events by sharing them with the person who'd known her best. "Tom," she wrote, I handled our first major family crisis without you, and I think I did it the way you would have wanted. I protected what mattered most, and I didn't let anyone convince me I was wrong to trust my instincts. The roses are blooming beautifully this year. I think they like the extra attention from their new gardener." She paused, thinking about everything that had led to this moment of peace. "I learned that being kind doesn't mean being weak, and being family doesn't mean accepting abuse. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. Sometimes protecting yourself is the same as protecting everyone you love." Outside her window, the neighborhood was settling into its evening routine. Children's voices calling to each other in the distance, porch lights flickering on, the familiar sounds of a community where people looked out for each other. I also learned that I'm not as alone as I thought I was. When the crisis came, people stepped up to help. Linda Pierce, Detective Rodriguez, Frank, and most importantly, Sarah, when she finally saw the truth clearly. It turns out that building genuine relationships over decades creates the kind of support network that can weather any storm. Maggie set down her pen and looked around the living room, where just hours ago, Emma had blown out 7 candles while surrounded by people who loved her for exactly who she was. The decorations were still up. The cake crumbs still needed sweeping, and the house still held the warm energy of genuine celebration. If someone in your life is making you doubt your own judgment about their behavior, trust that feeling, she said, looking toward the camera as if speaking directly to women who might be facing similar challenges. If someone is more interested in what you have than who you are, believe their actions over their words. And if someone tells you that questioning their motives makes you paranoid, that's usually when you need to question them most. The final scene showed 3 generations in the kitchen the next morning. Maggie teaching Emma her great-grandmother's cookie recipe, while Sarah worked at her laptop at the kitchen table, building the graphic design business that would give her true independence. The late morning light streamed through windows that Tom had installed with such care, illuminating a home that was once again filled with trust, safety, and authentic love. "Your story of standing up for yourself matters," Maggie's voice continued as the camera captured the comfortable routine of genuine family care. Whether it was with family, friends, or strangers, share in the comments how you found the courage to trust your instincts and protect what mattered most. And remember to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most challenging moments of our lives. The screen faded to black with the image of Emma's small hands mixing cookie dough under her grandmother's patient guidance, while Sarah's laughter provided the soundtrack to a family that had not only survived betrayal, but had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's discovering that your real family, your true allies, and your own inner strength are more powerful than any threat that comes against you. And sometimes, an old woman who refuses to be victimized can teach an entire community what courage really looks like.